Hello and welcome. Russia is returning to Soviet measures and Soviet weapons. This and more in the Situation Report. We start off with some information that is currently circulating around the information sphere. There was this volunteer, James Vasquez, who claimed to be a Ukrainian fighter. Supposedly, he collected millions of dollars in donation. And after somebody actually in the Ukrainian armed forces said that he is not part of the armed forces, he now deleted his account. It seems that he actually was on the front line at some point, but he never officially joined the Ukrainian armed forces. There are now pictures circulating around of bills that he supposedly made. Basically, not him issuing them, but that he was in a luxury hotel drinking Jack Daniels, and I don't even know how many Jack Daniels there was supposedly. So he spent a lot of money on booze while other people were dying for money supposedly donated to him. There's no further information how much of this is true. The only thing I can say is that these accusations are being hurled against them. It would not be the first time of somebody claiming to actually fight in Ukraine while he didn't, even though here with James Vasquez, it seems to be clear that at least at some point he actually was on the front line. Nevertheless, he deleted his account, so we can't see his point of view in this whole thing. Other than that, we have a new article by Seymour Hersh on his Substack in which he accuses Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, of helping the US to hide the US involvement in blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines. Unfortunately, Seymour Hersh's last story had so many holes in it and so many contradictions and so many things that didn't help that I don't really know what to do with this. I'm not taking it too serious, but it's up to you. You can read the article yourself. I don't see much of a point telling you what was the actual thing. He basically claims that the accusations that he is still right, there is nothing wrong, and the fact that there are supposedly some intelligence agency informations that Nord Stream was blown up by a group starting from a boat in Germany was published to discredit his story, and he blames the lack of reporting on his story on a conspiracy stopping his information, his story, while there have been articles disseminating his story and showing hole after hole in the whole plot. Nevertheless, read it yourself, get your own opinion about it. For me, this topic is getting increasingly annoying and tiresome because I don't see anything. Any story that is popping up seems to be containing a fair bit of plot holes. Nevertheless, let's start to the actual developments on the front line. On the northern front, on the eastern front, the northern part north of the Siversky Donetsk, we have reports of a Ukrainian counterattack on Ryanikivka and on Persho-Travneve here. Ukrainians seemingly have attacked there. We have no reports that they actually have been successful, though. The Russians have attacked here at Kuzemivka, Novoselivske, and they seem to have gained some ground in Novoselivske. Novoselivske is fought for months now as well, so in recent Russian attacks they might have gained some territory. There's also reports that the Russians actually gained some ground in the direction of Terny. I cannot exactly identify where it was, but they seem to have advanced somewhat further to the west here. Other than that, heavy fighting still around Kremina. No changes that can be observed here. South of the Siversky Donetsk, we have continued fighting for Bilohorivka and Verkhno-Kamyanske, which is here. So both are still attacked, but I cannot confirm any Russian successes. There are also continued attacks in the direction of Orikhovo, Vasilivka, but the Ukrainians are now saying that the intensity of Russian attacks on Bakhmut is rescinding, is going down. Ukrainians themselves have apparently made some counterattacks in Bakhmut itself, as both in the north as well as in the south of the city, likely trying to push in the area of the Asom industrial area to push the Russians back and to help secure the supply lines in the south from Ivanivske. How far they've been successful, I cannot confirm. There are some reports that they actually gained some ground again, but the fighting is going on, and on those Ukrainian counterattacks, Russian attacks followed. So I cannot really confirm how far those counterattacks have been successful in the longer term. So after an initial success, if they were able to hold the territory. Still, though, even though that we have reports of somewhat successful Ukrainian counterattacks, we still know that the have reports that the Russians gained some ground both in the area of Romove as well as Bodanivka. So on this front line, there are reports of the Russians advancing further, which would obviously continue to threaten the supply line through Romove. Whether there's still actually supply going through there is highly doubtful, as supposedly the whole part of the road here is fully accessible and fully visible to the Russians, and they can shoot at anything driving there with heavy machine guns or with anti-tank guided missiles. So whether that can still effectively being used by the Ukrainians without a high attrition rate is doubtful. Further south, we have reports of a Ukrainian counterattack in this area south of Ivanivska that has at least been partially successful. There are some videos circulating about it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of corpses visible, so I can't show you the video here. Still, the fighting is intense enough, and that the Ukrainian president feels the need to show support and to show presence in the area. Supposedly that was close to Bakhmut, so not in Bakhmut itself, but here you can see Volodymyr Zelensky with Ukrainian forces close to Bakhmut. At least that's what's being said. Obviously, I don't have a geolocation of this here, whether it was actually on the close to the front line in this regard. But publishing this shows that Zelensky keeps identifying himself with the defense of Bakhmut, which obviously makes it more important that it succeeds, as his own personality, his own standing within Ukraine is increasingly getting fixed to Bakhmut if he chooses to go to the front lines to meet his soldiers there. While obviously it's highly likely that it's helping the morale of the Ukrainian forces on the front line there. Further south, we have reports of ongoing fighting around Avdiivka, and it was actually fairly heavy. We have reports that the Russians increasingly use their air force around Avdiivka, so that seems to be one of the concentrations of the Russian air force attacks here, and there have been successes. Initially, there were reports that the Russians have captured Stepove. There are some reports that they actually never reached it. They got stuck here on the railway line, and a Ukrainian counterattack pushed them back, a Ukrainian counterattack involving heavy deployment of main battle tanks facing Russian main battle tanks, and then another Russian attack came from the south in the direction of Siverny, which was also stopped. Whatever happened there, the gains in territory are somewhat limited. It's likely that they gained some ground in the direction of Stepove, but in the south I cannot really confirm any successes of the Russian side just yet. Other than that, the fighting around Marinka and Vuhledar seems to have died down for the moment, at least. We have no additional reports of Russian significant offensive activity at either places. When we come to the southern front line, there is a number of reports of Ukrainian recon attacks, reconnaissance in forth, all south of Orikhiv. Whether this is an indication of the coming Ukrainian offensive or not is unclear. At least the Russian military bloggers are up at arms about it. They take it really serious as a precursor of a coming Ukrainian offensive. And there are reports that in Zaporizhzhia, in southern Oblast, in the occupied part of Zaporizhzhia, the Russians are hiring civilians to use for defensive constructions. That they spend money to additionally have workers doing that shows that they believe the forces they actually employ there, the military units that are there, are not enough to set up defensive perimeters, showing the higher priority of the region within the Russian planning, that they expect to significant Ukrainian attacks there that forces them to improve their defensive positions. Generally saying, the Ukrainians say the Russians are moving away troops from Bakhmut. And that's also what the British Ministry of Defense is saying. It seems that they are focusing on Avdiivka right now. It seems the redeployment feels like the Russians are now trying to hit the front line and see if they can get some breakthrough anywheres. And redeployment from troops from Bakhmut would be an indication that they feel that all of their attacks there are kind of in vain. It's obviously too early for that, but the whole redeployment from a point where they haven't even taken their objective yet is not really a sign of strength. It's unlikely that these redeployments will be successful in any even operational sense, but obviously it doesn't mean that they are necessarily without any chance that a sudden redeployment, a sudden increase of activity at some certain front line cannot achieve the breakthrough that the Russians have waited for in case of Avdiivka or Marinka for basically a year. Shoigu talked about the Air Force, and he said the Russians have flown 140,000 combat sorties since the beginning of the war. 19% of the tactical Air Force, tactical units of the Air Force, as well as the ground forces, air forces, so that should be the combat helicopters, have participated and gained combat experience. 60% of the strategic forces have gained combat experience. That should be the strategic bombers that are launching cruise missiles. And 85% of the UAV pilots have also gained combat experience in this war. If we break it down by roughly 400 days, that should mean 350 combat sorties per day, which is on the higher level of what is more or less reported throughout the war. Usually we talk about 250 to 300 combat sorties, so 350 might not be completely out of the reality, as the combat sorties might include on one side support flights like tankers, like AVAX, comparable, so the A-50s or something like this, while the other side does not count them, only counts units that are actually intending or actively participating in combat with the Ukrainian side. Regardless, this is more or less in line what we expected, and in the whole event, Shoigu also said that Bastion ASM anti-ship missiles are freshly positioned on the Kuril Islands, which seem to be some message intended for the Japanese side that they shouldn't get any ideas because of Russia's involvement in the current war, that basically the Kuril Islands will still be defended now with anti-ship missiles, as the Kuril Islands, a part of them, are claimed by Japan, which even prevented a peace treaty until now between the two countries. On the Crimea, we have reports about drone attacks on targets in Chankoi. Ukraine was saying they destroyed a railway transport of Caliber missiles. That is possible. Calibers are being used by the Black Sea Fleet, so they would probably move down here to Sevastopol to be loaded here. The Russians themselves say the attack was meant on an Air Force base. I think it should be this here, but they crashed in other buildings and they were shot down with the air defense systems. The explosions were actually fairly heavy that are visible, but we don't really know what they've hit. At least the Ukrainians claim that they managed to destroy a railway transport of calibers on the ground, but some indications are that this might not be true, so I can't fully confirm that as of now. We have a video of a Ukrainian drone going for here is being hit and blown up. That's a naval drone that was likely going for Sevastopol Harbor, which was killed here. H.I. Sutton, the naval OSINT publisher, I guess, talked about this new drone that was identified, and we have it here in comparison to the older drones that were used here. It's a new design, it's smaller, and it's again apparently supported by a Ukrainian bank that is that those drones were now used in the attack on Sevastopol. Other than that, there have also been attacks on the in the air by other drones, and supposedly they were also shot down. I think we should probably see it here. Turn this on here. Here's something. So the The air defense systems were engaging drones, and we see a drone hitting here. Whether that is obviously hitting its target or not is not really confirmed, and here is the engagement with the naval drones once again. Partisan activity has also been reported. We have an attack close to Simferopol on here on Crimea, where an IED blew up next to a gas pipeline, but according to the Russians, it didn't damage it. And Serhiy Moskalenko, who was a collaborator and the head of the Kherson Oblast, I guess, jail system, pre-detention system, was killed with an IED, likely by Ukrainian partisans as well. Kherson Oblast here in the southern occupied area. When it comes to mobilization, we have reports that the Russians are now turning to something close to the Stalin era, where soldiers are getting punished if they are being captured. The translation here is that if the capitulation happens when there was still a chance to fight back, then it's going to be considered a crime with punishment of up to 10 years in prison. If you are wounded and can't fight anymore, then you're not going to be punished. This is going back in the direction of what we saw in World War II, where Russian soldiers were forced to capitulate by being encircled due to the decisions of the Russian High Command, going back to Stalin's decision to not withdraw. And those soldiers were then later punished for the fact that they have been captured, even though the decisions to place them in points where they are encircled were not made by them, and the capitulation wasn't done by them either. So we see some movement back here in this regard, that the Russians are thinking about or are likely going to punish prisoners of war. Whether that's going to be helpful to prevent them from capitulating if they think they're otherwise going to die is one question. It should mean, though, that they are far less likely willing to go back to Russia in a prisoner exchange, which will probably hurt Ukraine, as it needs prisoners to exchange to receive its own prisoners of war in exchanges. There are also reports that the Russian military is threatening prisoners in regular jails to put them into cell blocks with what is being called cocks in the Russian prison culture, you could say. So the Russian prison culture is very hierarchical, I think is the word, or the pronunciation. Please excuse my pronunciation. Basically, it means that cocks are those that are being raped by everyone, and any association with them makes you a cock yourself. So if you touch one, if you sit next to one, if you share any contact with a cock except to rape him, then you are being considered a cock yourself in the Russian prison culture. And according to that, the Russian military is now threatening prisoners to either volunteer to Ukraine or being put together in cell blocks with the cocks, which obviously would put those prisoners, turn those prisoners, according to the prisoner culture, into cocks themselves and basically threaten them with continuous rape for the time of their imprisonment. Putin acknowledged that there are some problems with getting Western electronic components, but he says that this is basically giving the Russian state a chance to substitute with local production. De facto, basically, those sanctions are supposedly helping Russia to have more local production of high-tech equipment. Whether he's going to be successful to actually implement industrial capacity to produce high-tech equipment that is needed, especially in regards to microchips, can be seriously doubted. Financially, it's obviously not an alternative. Otherwise, it would already be produced in Russia. Even if Russia has the capability, it chose to buy abroad because it was much cheaper. So the financial burden will be higher. Whether the quality can even be achieved locally is a different question. So the most likely result of all of this will be that Russia is continuing to buy those equipment, the Western equipment, but using the black market, using third countries, leading to much higher purchasing prices and thus a higher financial burden for the Russian state to receive the same parts and to produce the same items. The Ukrainian military intelligence GUR is also believing that Russia is doing a crypto mobilization, is continuing this, and they now said numbers. They believe that Russia is mobilizing 20,000 soldiers a month. Now we have some numbers when it comes to the Russian mobilization. In the political sphere, we have an unmistakably clear gesture by the Japanese Prime Minister. He visited Kiev and did a wreath-laying, I think that's the word, ceremony at Bucha, where the massacres were where the massacres had happened, where the Russian war crimes had happened. Showing himself there in a visit like this is obviously a clear sign of support for Ukraine and is likely the result for Shoigu's redeployment of anti-ship missiles onto the Kuril Islets. Prigozhin said the governor of Krasnodar Krai has now invited a Wagner representative, and the governor also overruled local prohibitions for burying Wagner fighters. That is a sign that this kind of alliance between Prigozhin and the government of Krasnodar Krai is continuing nevertheless, what we heard before. And we have a report here from Telegram, Grey Zone. Grey Zone is a Wagner Telegram channel, and they are basically saying that the Ministry of Defense is sabotaging the rotation of personnel of the Wagner Group. So it is basically preventing Wagner from moving fighters from Africa to Russia that could then be used in Ukraine to weaken Wagner. At the same time, Wagner is about to get significantly weaker because the remaining prisoners that have been recruited are nearing the end of their 6-month term. That, according to the agreement, was if they fight for 6 months and survive, they're going to get a pardon and they can leave. So unless Prigozhin somehow tries to back down from that and is capable of doing so, a significant part of his fighting force that is still alive will also leave his unit within the next few months or within the next few weeks. And finally, we have another report from the governmental sphere of Russia to the ICC decision to indict Vladimir Putin. Medvedev, the former president, threatened to attack the ICC with hypersonic missiles. We know that Medvedev is kind of saber rattling the whole time, so it shouldn't be taken too serious, but it's kind of amusing to hear that he's threatening to use hypersonic missiles to attack a courthouse within a NATO country. Obviously, it shouldn't be taken too serious. When it comes to the international support, we have an interesting video here of seeing French Crotal close SHORAD, short-range air defense system, that is being used here in the to shoot down a Russian cruise missile, and we can see that the second missile that was fired is hitting its target while the first one has missed. The British Ministry of Defense has announced that they're going to deliver depleted uranium APFSDS to Ukraine, and Russia has turned that into a big drama of nuclear, using the buzzwords nuclear and escalation and things like this. But somebody, funnily enough, found that when Russia in 2018 used uranium, declared that they are going to use DU rounds on their T-80s, they insisted that it does not violate any international treaties, and the same news outlet is now saying it's violating fundamental norms of international law. Depleted uranium is being used because it's cheap, and B, it's highly durable and having a heavy weight. So the darts are more affordable than tungsten ones, and they have a high penetration power. They cannot be used for nuclear weapons in any regard, as they are only uranium 238 that cannot be used to maintain a chain reaction. The US have now declared that they are going to deliver M1A1 instead of the M1A2, and they will be coming out of depots, which should allow for a significantly faster delivery. Still, though, the delivery is supposedly not happening before the autumn of 2023, and here it's unclear whether supposedly they are going to take out depleted uranium armor from those tanks. At least that's the things you always hear, that supposedly they don't want or they can't deliver their own stored tanks because they have depleted uranium armor, and the US is not delivering that to other countries. That's a purely political decision that could be overruled any day by any US president, as far as my knowledge goes. But there are also rumors that supposedly the US can take the armor apart, remove the depleted uranium and add something else instead. Maybe that's happening, maybe that's true. I'm somewhat doubtful that this is actually working, because the armor system doesn't seem to be modular to the degree where you can just unplug a few screws and take out parts of it. But I might be wrong there. Nevertheless, now the move is away from freshly produced tanks to tanks that will be available sooner, which might allow bigger deliveries if the US government decides, though, as obviously the number of stored tanks go into the thousands, whereas the production capability of the US is limited, and there are customers waiting for their freshly produced tanks. There has been a video of T-55s being moved to westwards from Siberia. The discussion right now is, does this mean they are going to use them in Ukraine? We can take a few informations out of this. You see them here on a railway transport. First of all, Ryan Macbeth, the American YouTuber, believes that they are going to be used for artillery purposes. He thinks because they aren't modernized, they haven't received ERA, they could be used as basically mobile gun platforms from far behind the front line, as Iran is producing modern 100mm high explosive rounds that can be used inside of the D10 that is in use with T-55s. Nevertheless, we should take a lesson out of this, that if you look around who mentioned tank stores within Russia, what Russia still has stored, any information you could find officially, you usually wouldn't find T-55s before. In previous videos, I mentioned that from my knowledge, everything that is reported to be stored in Russia only has to be reported if it's west of the Urals. So whatever is east of it should not even be on that list. That doesn't necessarily mean the Russians will have 40,000 T-55s in their storage. The numbers are likely significantly lower, and the question is how much of this they can actually reuse. But in total capability, the T-55 is not that much weaker than the T-62. Yes, of course, armor and armament are significantly different, but they are not a whole leap in capability, even though, for instance, I have the example from the Eastern German Soviet state or Warsaw Pact state that decided to not even buy T-62s because they judged that the T-52s are basically as close in capability that it doesn't justify buying a new tank at that point. So if Russia is already using T-62 and finds a use for that, it kind of makes sense that if they have T-55s that are available, where they have ammo, where they have spare parts available, that they would use them as well. In the basic capability, the difference shouldn't be so massive that this is a big surprise. The surprise is, though, that they still have T-55s in storage if you listen to the number of videos that are found on YouTube, where I have not seen a single one mentioning T-55s before. As said, if I'm right, then everything Russia needs to report or needed to report in the past was west of the Urals. What is east is unknown, but then again, in which shape it is a whole different story as well. Then there is a link. We have something here that Politico is reporting. The Ukrainians are really fast in learning how to handle the Patriot system. So while initially it was thought it can take up to a year, the Patriot missile air defense batteries will be available in Ukraine likely much, much faster, because the Ukrainian government sent its most capable soldiers, probably some that speak English as well, to increase the training to make it faster, to allow for the deployment of the batteries at an earlier time. And we now have here a picture of supposedly a fresh production run of 122 grenades that are being given to Ukraine. That's important, as it's a Soviet caliber, which the production capabilities in the West were fairly limited. Those are supposedly freshly produced. The rumors are they are from Poland, and the interesting part, what we can see here, is that it's on pallets. So unlike the Russian system, this, as we can see here, can be moved with forklifts. I quickly had to look up the name. As we can see, it's from Ukroboronprom. So that's the Ukrainian defense company, which should mean that this is coming from a Ukrainian factory that is situated outside of Ukraine, likely in Poland, where they are now being produced here. And finally, we have here several members of the Congress in the US have asked the US president to give Ukraine cluster ammunition. US still holds storage. Cluster ammunition is not really banned worldwide, but it's fought against. The problem with cluster ammunition is that it is a high rate of dots that are basically then are being turned into something like landmines that can kill people after decades later. As supposedly the majority of the cluster ammunition is, or the cluster ammunition, if it failed, it's supposed to blow up with a time fuse later, but the dud rate was usually up to, there are some numbers of up to 40%. So as this is mining areas, effectively mining big areas, there was an international attempt to ban it, but several countries, a lot of countries, basically all the countries that still believe they have to fight serious wars, didn't join those. And that doesn't mean that cluster ammunition is praised or is easy to sell politically, which is one of the reasons the US don't hand it over to Ukraine yet. But if Ukraine is using it on their own turf, that obviously means they put the problem of solving the demining issue on their own shoulders, not on somebody else's, which should be their own responsibility. Cluster ammunition is extremely effective, though, against targets in the open and even on trench systems. The likelihood of small cluster sub-ammunition falling into individual trenches is obviously much higher, as it basically creates a carpet of sub-ammunition. So even wiping out trench systems is can be done fairly effectively with cluster ammunition. So it's an extremely powerful system, but it's considered controversial internationally. That doesn't mean it's not effective, though. It actually is. So we see US parliamentarians asking for it to be handed over. And I want to finish something up here. We have a Tiger which has contact 1 being put on. I'm not completely sure if that picture is new. I think it's somewhat older, but I seem to believe I've seen it before. In the past on this channel, we talked about explosive reactive armor, but we have this is not the way you use it, because while it's highly effective or fairly effective against shaped charges like ATGMs, like heat grenades from other tanks, like rocket-propelled grenades, like shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, the problem is it's still an explosive. So if you fire it up on a thin metal skin, the likelihood of it being basically creating more explosive damage by pushing the skin into the tank is extremely high. That's why you usually don't see ERA on light-skinned IFVs, APCs, unless, of course, we look into this war, because the armor of those IFVs and APCs is usually considered to be too thin to allow for the deployment of ERA, but we see it here on APCs being used. I personally would probably prefer to be in this here without ERA than with. Regardless, that was it from me for now. If you enjoyed what I did, then I would appreciate a thumbs up, leave a comment for the algorithm, and if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you, so if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting the channel. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.